Wind scoured the Wyoming plain, etching loneliness into the weathered timbers of Amos Kane's ranch. Inside, solitude was his only companion, carved deep by war and winter. Then, a knock shattered the blizzard's roar. A woman, ghost pale, clutching a child like broken china, pleading for shelter against a killing cold. He said yes for one night. He didn't know yes could last forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The axe bit deep into the gnarled juniper log, the thwack echoing dully in the vast white silence. Amos Kane straightened, a plume of breath hanging like smoke in the air before him. The late afternoon sun, already a weak, watery eye on the horizon, bled pale gold across the snowfields, failing to warm the bone-deep cold that gripped the high plains. Wind, relentless and sharp as a skinning knife, keened around the corners of his log cabin, finding every chink in the mud and straw chinking, whispering promises of the long night to come. He hefted the split wood, the rough grain biting into his calloused palms even through thick gloves, and added it to the dwindling pile against the cabin wall. Each piece was a small victory against the encroaching freeze. Inside, the cabin offered scant refuge. The single room held the chill like a stone holds water. The hearth, built of river rock he'd hauled himself years ago, held a low, sullen fire that struggled against the drafts. Its flickering light danced over sparse, functional furnishings, a rough-hewn table, a single chair, a cot piled high with furs in the corner. The air smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and the underlying tang of loneliness that had seeped into the very timbers. On a high shelf, gathering dust, sat a single incongruity, a small carved wooden bird, painted blue long ago, its colors faded, a relic from a life before the war, before the solitude became a second skin. Amos rarely looked at it. Looking invited remembering, and remembering invited ghosts best left buried. He knelt before the hearth, feeding the fire a precious piece of split pine. The resin hissed and popped, sending sparks fleeing up the chimney into the bruised dusk. He watched the flames, their hypnotic dance failing to quiet the restless hum beneath his ribs. It was always worse in winter, this feeling of being the last man on a frozen earth. The war had carved hollows in him, leaving behind a landscape of scars visible and unseen. Crowds in Cheyenne made his hands twitch towards a Colt holster at his hip. The false bonhomie of saloons rang like tinny lies. The ranch, this harsh, beautiful emptiness, was sanctuary and prison both. He tended his few head of cattle, hardy beasts huddled miserably in the meager shelter of the leeward barn. Repaired fences the wind seemed determined to dismantle, and waited for spring, for something, anything that wasn't this endless, echoing quiet. The wind rose, a sudden banshee wail that rattled the door in its frame. Snow, fine as powdered glass, hissed against a single small window. A true Wyoming blizzard was gathering its breath out there on the open plain, promising white oblivion. Amos banked the fire carefully, the ritualistic movements a small anchor against the gathering storm. He moved to the window, rubbing a patch clear on the frost-etched pane with the heel of his hand. Beyond, the world was dissolving into a swirling gray-white fury. The distant, saw-toothed ridge of the Bighorn Mountains, usually a stark silhouette, had vanished, his few skeletal cottonwoods bent like supplicants before the gale. Nothing moved but the snow, driven horizontal by the wind's furious hand. He shivered, not entirely from the cold. Nights like this felt like the edge of the world. He was turning away, reaching for the battered coffee pot to set near the embers for the long watch ahead, when the sound cut through the wind's roar. Not the mournful howl of a coyote pack driven to desperation, nor the groan of straining timber. It was a sharp, frantic rapping. On his door, Amos froze. His hand dropped instinctively to the worn walnut grip of the Colt, revolver holstered at his thigh. No one came out here, not in good weather, and certainly not in the teeth of a rising blizzard. His mind raced. Trapper lost? Drifter seeking shelter? Or something worse? The war had taught him caution was more than a virtue. It was survival. He moved silently, boots whispering on the packed earth floor, pressing his back against the rough log wall beside the door. The rapping came again, weaker this time, desperate. A woman's voice, thin and frayed with cold, pierced the wood. Please, please help us. Us. The word hung in the frigid air. Amos hesitated. Every instinct honed by years of isolation and conflict screaming at him to stay silent, to let the storm take whatever was out there. But beneath the ingrained wariness, a deeper, older pull stirred. The voice held a raw edge of terror that bypassed reason. He slid the heavy iron bolt back slowly, the scrape loud in the sudden lull of wind. Gripping the Colt, he eased the door open just a crack, the biting cold and the swirl of snow rushing in. Two figures huddled on his threshold, barely visible in the gloom. A woman, wrapped in a threadbare shawl crusted with ice, her face a pale oval etched with exhaustion and fear. Her dark eyes, wide and desperate, met his. She clutched a bundle tight against her chest. No, not a bundle. A child, a small girl, perhaps 5 or 6, her face buried against a woman's neck. Only a tangled mess of dark hair and a glimpse of unnaturally pale cheek visible. The child was utterly still, wrapped in a thin quilt that offered scant protection against the elements. Please, the woman gasped, her breath clouding instantly. Her lips were blue-tinged, her knuckles white where she gripped the child. The storm! We won't last a night. She swayed, her strength clearly failing. The child didn't stir. Amos's gaze flickered beyond them, scanning the swirling white nothingness. Were they alone? Was this a ruse? His knuckles whitened on the Colt's grip. The woman saw the weapon, flinched almost imperceptibly, but didn't back down. Her exhaustion wore with fierce, protective light in her eyes. One night, she pleaded, her voice cracking. Just shelter for her sake. She shifted slightly, trying to shield the child from his scrutiny and the wind's bite. He looked at the child. The unnatural stillness was more frightening than any overt threat. He saw the faint tremor running through the small form, the way the tiny hands, peeking from the quilt, were clenched into fists like frozen berries. His own ghosts, the cries of the wounded, the faces of the lost, seemed to swirl in the snow behind them. But it was the utter vulnerability of the child that breached the walls he'd built. A memory, sharp and unwanted. A different child, laughing in sunlight long gone. His jaw tightened. Get inside, he growled, the words rough, and used the human address. He stepped back, holstering the Colt but keeping his body tense, his stance wary. Relief washed over the woman's face, so profound it looked like pain. She stumbled over the threshold, the child dead weight in her arms. Amos slammed the door shut against the blizzard's renewed fury, bolting it securely. The sudden relative quiet inside was thick with tension and the smell of wet wool and desperation. The woman stood just inside, dripping snowmelt onto the hard-packed floor, swaying slightly. She scanned the small room with a quick, hunted look, her gaze lingering on the corners, the shuttered window, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Her shawl had fallen back, revealing a face too young for the deep lines of worry etched around her eyes, and dark hair escaping a messy braid. Her clothes, beneath the shawl, were simple homespun, worn thin, and patched at the elbows. Not fancy, but not the rags of a drifter either. There was a quiet dignity in her bearing, even broken as she was. Amos pointed wordlessly toward the hearth. She moved towards the fire's meager warmth like a moth drawn to a flame, sinking to her knees on the hard floor, still clutching the child. She peeled back the sodden quilt with trembling, reddened hands. Frostbite mottled her knuckles. The child, a little girl, lay limp in her lap. Her face was waxen, her breathing shallow and rapid. Dark lashes fanned against cheeks that held no healthy flush, only a frightening pallor. She didn't cry, didn't open her eyes, just shivered violently in waves. "Ellie," the woman whispered, her voice thick. She rubbed the small, cold hands between her own, blowing warm breath onto them. "Ellie, sweetheart, wake up a little. We're safe now. We're warm." The words were a desperate incantation. The child gave a tiny, shuddering sigh, but remained frighteningly still. Amos watched, a knot of unfamiliar emotion tightening in his chest. He'd seen men die of exposure on the plains. The child's stillness spoke of a danger far more immediate than any imagined threat from the woman. He moved past his ingrained reticence, driven by a primal urge he couldn't name. He grabbed the thickest wolf pelt from his own cot, the one he'd trapped and cured himself years ago. Without a word, he stepped forward and draped it heavily over both the woman and the child, tucking it roughly around their shivering forms. The woman flinched again at his sudden proximity, her eyes darting up to his face, wide with residual fear and surprise. Then, as the weight and surprising warmth of the first settled over them, her gaze softened, filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," she breathed, the words barely audible over the crackle of fire and the wind's howl. "Thank you, Mr. Kane," he muttered, stepping back quickly, uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze. "Amos Kane." He busied himself with the fire, adding more precious wood, stoking it until the flames leapt higher, casting flickering, elongated shadows on the walls. The cabin began to lose its knife-edge chill, replaced by a dry, smoky warmth. He filled the battered coffee pot with snowmelt from a bucket near the door and set it close to the flames. He needed the bitter brew, needed the familiar ritual to ground him. He stole glances at the pair by the fire. The woman, Clara, he remembered her gasping the name earlier, was gently stroking Ellie's hair, murmuring soft, reassuring words. The color was slowly, agonizingly slowly, returning to the child's cheeks. Her shivering lessened. Clara's own posture relaxed a fraction, though her eyes still held a watchful tension, constantly flicking towards a bolted door. She moved with a weary grace, a hint of strength beneath the exhaustion. What had driven a woman, and a child so young, into such a lethal storm? The question hung heavy in the warming air. Trouble followed people. Trouble had a way of finding lonely places. The wind slammed against the cabin with renewed fury, a reminder of the world outside, white and blind and deadly. Amos knew the blizzard would trap him here for days, not just one night. The reality settled on him like the snow piling against his door. One night, he'd promised one night, but the storm and the child's fragile state mocked that promise. Later, needing more would last the long hours ahead, Amos pulled on his heavy coat and hat, bracing himself. He unbolted the door, fighting against the winds pushed to open it just wide enough to slip out. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Snow stung his face. He grabbed a few split logs from the pile beside the door, his movements quick and efficient. As he turned to duck back inside, a flicker of movement caught his eye, low to the ground near the edge of the barn, partially obscured by the blowing snow. Not an animal, too purposeful. A shape, dark against the white, darting behind the rough-hewn corner. Then gone. His blood ran colder than the wind. Had he imagined it? A trick of the storm and the failing light? He strained his eyes, scanning the swirling white chaos. Nothing, only the relentless howl of the wind and the driving snow. But the prickle on the back of his neck remained. He slammed the door shut, bolting it with more force than necessary, the logs tumbling from his arms onto the floor. He turned, his gaze locking onto Clara, who had looked up sharply at the sound, her face etched with sudden, fresh terror that mirrored the cold dread now coiling in his own gut. The storm wasn't the only thing outside his door. The one night had just become infinitely more complicated. The slam of the door echoed like a gunshot in the sudden, wind-muffled quiet of the cabin. Amos stood with his back pressed against the heavy timber, the rough grain biting through his coat. The logs he dropped lay scattered at his feet. Outside, the blizzard screamed its fury, a white beast trying to claw its way in. Inside, a different kind of storm raged, silent and thick with unspoken dread. Clara stared at him from her place by the fire, the wolf pelt pulled tight around herself, and Ellie, her eyes wide and dark in the firelight, held a fresh terror that mirrored the icy knot tightening in Amos's own gut. That fleeting shape near the barn, trick of the storm, or something else, something worse. He forced himself to move, bending stiffly to gather the split wood. Each piece felt heavier than it should. He stacked them near the hearth with deliberate care, the mundane action of flimsy shield against a rising tide of unease. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to flinch from the corners. Ellie stirred feebly under the fur, a small, muffled whimper escaping her lips. Clara immediately bent over her, murmuring reassurances that sounded thin, frayed at the edges. "She's warming," Clara said, her voice barely above the fire's whisper. It wasn't addressed to him, more a statement to herself, a fragile hope spoken aloud. Amos grunted, an acknowledgement that cost him nothing. He busied himself with the coffee pot, now hissing softly as the snowmelt within began to heat. The familiar, bitter scent offered scant comfort. His gaze kept straying to the bolted door, then to the single frost-rimed window, opaque now with driven snow. Was someone out there, watching, waiting for the storm to ease? Or were his war-honed nerves, stretched thin by years of solitude, conjuring phantoms in the blizzard's white noise? He remembered patrols in Tennessee winters, the eerie silence after snowfall, the way every snapped twig could be a rebel scout. He remembered Private Davy Henderson, barely 18, frozen stiff at his post-one bitter dawn, a look of mild surprise still etched on his young face. Death by cold was patient. It didn't need bullets. He poured the steaming coffee into a chipped tin mug, the heat seeping through the metal into his chilled hands. He hesitated, then filled a second mug. He held it out towards Clara, not looking directly at her. "Drink. Warm you up." She flinched, just slightly, her eyes darting from the mug to his face, then back to Ellie, suspicion warred with a desperate need for warmth. After a tense moment, she reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing his as she took the mug. They were ice cold, the knuckles raw and red. She cradled it close, letting the steam bathe her face. She didn't drink immediately, just held it, her gaze fixed on the flames. Amos moved back to the table, leaning against it, sipping his own coffee. It was strong, bitter, a taste as familiar and unyielding as the land outside. He watched them. Clara, hunched protectively over her child, looked exhausted beyond measure. The firelight softened the harsh lines of fear around her eyes, but deepened the hollows beneath her cheekbones. There was a quiet strength in the set of her shoulders, a defiance that hadn't been entirely extinguished by whatever had driven her onto the plains in a blizzard. Ellie's breathing seemed less shallow now, a little steadier, though her face remained disturbingly pale against the dark fur. She burrowed deeper, seeking the warmth her small body couldn't generate. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the fire's crackle, the wind's mournful howl, and Ellie's soft, rhythmic breaths. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was a taut wire humming with unasked questions and unspoken fears. Amos felt the weight of his own isolation press in, heavier than usual. He was used to the quiet, even welcomed it most days as a balm against the noisy ghosts of the past. But this shared silence, filled with the vulnerability of the strangers and the specter of whatever might be outside, felt suffocating. He was a keeper of this fragile refuge, a role he hadn't asked for and didn't want, needing to break the tension, if only for himself. Amos rummaged in a small wooden crate tucked under his cot. He pulled out a worn leather pouch. Inside were a few simple things: a whetstone, a length of rawhide cord, a stub of tallow candle, and a small hand-carved wooden comb. The comb was made of smooth cherry wood, its teeth uneven but polished by time. He'd carved it years ago, during a long winter, more to keep his hands busy than out of need. He rarely used it himself. He walked back towards the hearth, stopping a respectful distance away. He held out the comb. "For the child," he said, his voice rough. Hairs tangled. He gestured vaguely towards Ellie's dark, matted hair, peeking out from fur. Clara looked from the comb to his face, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, he thought she would refuse, shrinking further into herself. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her fingers closed around the smooth wood. She didn't thank him, but her posture softened infinitesimally. Turning back to Ellie, she began the slow, careful work of untangling the knots. Her movements were gentle, practiced. She dipped the comb's teeth into the tin mug of water Amos had left near the hearth for them, using the moisture to ease the snarls. Each stroke was deliberate, a small act of care in the midst of chaos. Amos watched the ritual, the simple intimacy of a mother tending her child. It was a sight so alien to his solitary existence. It felt like peering into a different world, a world he deliberately walled himself off from. He retreated to the table again, giving her space, but his mind wouldn't quiet. Who was she running from? A husband? Lawmen? Debt collectors? The possibilities were grim and numerous in this hard territory. Her clothes, though worn, weren't those of a pauper. That locket chain glinting faintly at her throat, what memory did it hold? And the child, Ellie, so small, so frighteningly still just hours before. Seeing her cling to life stirred something deep and long buried within him. It wasn't just Henderson's frozen face he saw now. It was a ghost of his own younger sister, Sarah, taken by fever back in Ohio when he was just a boy. He remembered her small hand clutching his, hot and dry, the helpless terror as the light faded from her eyes. He'd been powerless then. He wasn't entirely powerless now. He had shelter. He had warmth. He had a rifle. The thought made his gaze drift to the Winchester, leaning against the wall near the door. Its presence was a cold comfort. He didn't want violence. He'd seen enough of it to last 3 lifetimes. But the image of that dark shape near the barn, fleeting but undeniable, wouldn't leave him. Was it connected to Clara? Or just a lost traveler seeking the same shelter? Doubt gnawed at him. A lost traveler wouldn't lurk. They'd knock, or freeze. He couldn't stay idle. The uncertainty was worse than knowing. He finished his coffee in a scalding gulp, the bitterness grounding him. He pulled his heavy coat back on, the damp was chilling him instantly. He took his hat and the rifle. Clara's head snapped up, the comb freezing in mid-stroke. Fear flooded her eyes again. Where you going? The question was sharp, laced with panic. Barn, he stated flatly, not meeting her gaze. Need to check the mare. It was a half-truth. The old draft horse, Bess, was huddled in her stall, likely bored but safe enough. But the barn was where he'd seen something. Winds fierce. Might have damaged the roof. He slid the heavy iron bolt back, the sound loud and final. Barred after me. He didn't wait for her response, didn't look back. He yanked the door open against the wind's pressure and plunged into the white maelstrom. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Snow instantly coated his lashes, stung his cheeks. The world was reduced to a swirling, howling gray-white fury. Visibility was barely 10 feet. He shouldered the rifle, holding it low and ready, scanning the immediate area as best he could. The cabin wall was a solid, reassuring presence at his back. He edged along it, boots crunching through the deepening drift. Toward the corner where the barn stood, a darker smudge in the blinding snow. The wind tore at him, threatening to knock him off balance. He kept his head down, squinting against the icy pellets. Reaching the corner of the cabin, he paused, pressing himself against the rough logs. He scanned the open space between the cabin and the barn. Nothing moved but the relentless snow. He strained his ears, but the wind's roar drowned out all other sound. Taking a deep, frigid breath, he pushed off and made a dash for the barn door. He reached the heavy double doors, crusted with ice. He fumbled with the latch, his gloved fingers clumsy with cold. Finally it gave, and he shouldered one door open just enough to slip inside. The relative quiet within was startling. The thick log walls muffled the storm's fury to a low, constant rumble. The air smelled of dust, dry hay, and the warm, earthy scent of Bess, who snorted softly from her stall in the gloom. Faint light filtered through cracks in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust and hayseed. Amos stood just inside, letting his eyes adjust, his breath clouding in the cold air. He listened intently. Only Bess was steady munching on hay and the wind outside. He moved cautiously down the central aisle, the packed dirt floor hard under his boots. His gaze swept the shadows of the empty stalls, the piles of hay, the tools hanging on the far wall. Nothing seemed disturbed. Bess watched him with placid and curious eyes. He walked toward the back wall, where a small door led to the tack room. It was slightly ajar. He always kept it closed. His pulse quickened. He nudged it open with a rifle barrel, stepping inside. The small room was dim, smelling strongly of leather and saddle soap. His saddles, bridles, and tools hung neatly on pegs. Nothing appeared missing. He turned to leave, frustration warring with relief. Had he imagined it? The storm could play tricks on a man's eyes, especially eyes strained from years of scanning horizons for threats both real and imagined. Then he saw it, near the back corner, where the wall met the dirt floor, partially obscured by a pile of old burlap sacks. A footprint, not his own broad, flat-heel boot print. This was smaller, narrower, with a distinct, squared-off heel. Fresh. The snow tracked and around the edges hadn't yet melted fully into the dirt. Someone had been in here. Recently, they'd come in from the storm, seeking temporary shelter, and hadn't wanted to be seen. Amos knelt, ignoring the cold seeping through his trousers. He examined the print, one clear impression, then scuff marks leading back toward the door he'd just entered. Whoever had come in lingered briefly near the sacks, perhaps just catching their breath, perhaps looking for something, and then left the way they came, back into the blizzard. Why? To watch the cabin? To wait? He straightened, a cold certainty settling over him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Trouble had found his doorstep. It wasn't lost. It was deliberate. He moved swiftly back through the barn, checking Bess briefly. She was fine, unconcerned, and then stepped back out into the storm's teeth. He scanned the white chaos once more, rifle held ready. Nothing, only the endless, driving snow. He hurried back to the cabin door, pounding on it with his fist. "It's Kane!" He heard the scrape of the bolt, and the door opened just enough for him to stumble back inside. He slammed it shut, bolted it, and leaned against it, breathing hard, snow melting from his coat and hat onto the floor. Clara stood several feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, the comb clutched in one hand like a weapon. Her eyes were huge, questioning, terrified. "Well," she whispered, the word barely audible. Amos met her gaze, his own expression grim. He didn't speak immediately. Stripping off his wet coat and hanging it near the fire, he leaned the rifle against the wall again, the action deliberate. Finally, he turned back to her. Someone was in the barn. Not long ago. Tracks. He kept his voice low, matter of fact. The color drained from Clara's face. She swayed, putting a hand out to steady herself against the rough-hewn mantelpiece. Her knuckles were white, all the fragile progress, the tiny moments of hesitant trust, evaporated like smoke. Her fear wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a tangible, suffocating presence in the room. Her eyes darted to Ellie, cocooned in the fur, sleeping fitfully now, then back to Amos, filled with a desperate, hunted look. "They found us," she breathed, the words a broken sigh, heavy with inevitability. Then lower, almost to herself, a name escaping like a prayer or a curse. Ben. The single syllable hung in the air, charged with a world of unspoken history and dread. Ben. Not a question, a statement, a name that meant pursuit. Amos stared at her, the blizzard's howl outside suddenly sounding like the approach of something far more dangerous than winter. The one night had become a siege, and the enemy had a name. The name hung in the air like gun smoke after a shot. Ben, sharp, dangerous, and heavy with unspoken dread. Clara's hand flew to her throat, fingers instinctively closing around a small, tarnished locket hidden beneath the collar of her worn dress. Her eyes, wide and dark with terror, locked onto Amos's, searching for disbelief, condemnation, perhaps even the flicker of betrayal, finding only grim assessment in his weathered face. She swayed, her knuckles white where she gripped the mantelpiece for support. Outside, the blizzard's howl seemed to mock the fragile sanctuary within the cabin walls. Amos didn't move for a long moment. The cold certainty he'd felt in the barn solidified. Trouble had a name now. It wasn't random. It was personal, and it had followed Clara and her child onto his land, into his solitude. The footprint, the lurking presence. It all coalesced around that single, damning syllable. He watched Clara crumple internally. The brief flicker of hesitant trust they'd built over the shared comb and the warming fire extinguished by raw fear. Her gaze darted constantly to Ellie, still cocooned in the wolf pelt, her breathing shallow but steady in sleep, then back to the bolted door, as if expecting it to burst inward. Ben, Amos repeated, his voice low, scraping against the silence. Not a question, an acknowledgement. Clara flinched as if struck. She nodded once, a jerky, fearful motion. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. The weight of whatever history that name carried pressed down on her, bowing her shoulders. She looked suddenly smaller, more broken than when she'd first stumbled in from the storm. Amos turned away from the naked fear in her eyes. It was a look he knew too well, a reflection of the hunted creature he'd sometimes felt like himself years ago. He moved with deliberate calm, a counterpoint to the storm raging outside and the panic threatening to consume Clara within. He checked the heavy iron bolt on the door, running a callous thumb over its cold, solid length. Reassuring, he tested the shutters on a single window, ensuring the wooden bar securing them from the inside was firmly seated. He scanned the room, the rifle leaning against the wall near the door, his Colt holstered at his hip, the firewood stack within easy reach. Sanctuary, fortress, prison. It was all three now. The wind slammed against the cabin like a battering ram, rattling the door in its frame. Snow hissed against the logs. The fire spat and crackled, casting restless shadows that danced across Clara's pale, strained face. Amos picked up the battered coffee pot, refilled it with snowmelt from the bucket, and set it back near the embers. The mundane ritual was a lifeline. He needed to do, not just wait for the axe to fall. "Eat," he said gruffly, gesturing towards a small sack of hardtack biscuits and the wedge of strong cheese he placed on the table earlier. He hadn't offered it before, sensing her refusal would be swift. Now, survival was paramount. You need strength. Clara stared at the meager fare, then back at him, suspicion warring with a bone-deep weariness. Her stomach chose that moment to betray her with a faint, audible rumble. Color flooded her cheeks, a stark contrast to her pallor. Shame flickered across her features, quickly replaced by that familiar, protective defiance. But the defiance was weaker now, frayed by cold and terror. Hesitantly, she pushed herself away from the mantel and moved towards the table. She didn't sit, just picked up a biscuit, breaking off a small piece with trembling fingers. She ate it slowly, mechanically, her gaze distant, focused inward on some private horror Amos could only guess at. He watched her, leaning against the table himself, arms crossed. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Ellie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, a small fist clenching the edge of the wolf pelt. Clara instantly abandoned the biscuit, rushing back to kneel beside her daughter, smoothing her hair, murmuring soft reassurances. The fierce tenderness in the gesture, the absolute focus on the child, struck Amos anew. It reminded him of Sarah, his sister, and the helpless agony of watching her fade. He'd been just a boy then, powerless against the fever. He wasn't a boy anymore. War. The word escaped him before he could stop it, rough and unexpected. Clara's head snapped up, startled. She searched his face, confusion warring with the residual fear. "What?" "You're trouble." Amos gestured vaguely, encompassing the unseen threat outside, the name hanging between them. "He a soldier? Like me?" He saw the flicker of understanding, then a deeper fear. He pushed, needing context, however small. Or just a man who thinks he owns what ain't his? He kept his voice flat, devoid of judgment, merely seeking information vital to survival. Clara looked down at Ellie, her fingers tracing the curve of the child's cheek. When she spoke, her voice was so low Amos had to strain to hear it over the wind. "Not war. Worse." She swallowed hard. "Ben, he don't need a uniform to take what he wants. He takes it anyway." Her fingers tightened on the locket chain, a nervous tick. He thought we belonged to him. Me, the farm. Her gaze lifted, meeting Amos's, filled with a bleakness that chilled him more than the storm. Ellie, she wasn't part of his plan. A complication. He don't like complications. The unspoken implication hung heavy. Ben dealt with complications harshly, permanently. Her hand tightened protectively over her sleeping daughter. A cold fury, different from the icy dread of the blizzard, began to simmer in Amos's gut. He knew men like that. Bullies. Tyrants on a smaller scale than armies, but just as destructive. He'd seen what happened to those deemed complications in the chaos after battles. The memory was sharp. A young woman in a burned-out Tennessee farmhouse, her terror mirroring Clara's now. They'd arrived too late. He pushed the image away. He wouldn't be too late here. Not for the child. He pushed off from the table. Storms easing. It wasn't not truly, but the banshee wail had lessened to a persistent, groaning wind. The snowfall seemed less dense, visibility perhaps extending a few desperate yards beyond the cabin. Gonna check the creek, see if it's frozen solid. Might be a way. He trailed off. A way to what? Escape? With a sick child and a woman half dead from exhaustion into a landscape still hostile? But staying felt like waiting for a snake to strike. He needed to know if Ben was still out there, watching, waiting for his moment. He pulled on his coat and hat. The damp was cold and stiff. He picked up the Winchester, the weight familiar and grimly comforting. He didn't look at Clara as he unbolted the door. "Keep it barred." "Be careful," she whispered, the word surprising him. Surprising her too, by the look on her face. It wasn't just fear for herself or Ellie. It held a flicker of concern for him, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built. He nodded curtly and stepped out into the white world. The cold was a physical assault, stealing his breath. Snow still fell, but the wind had shifted, no longer driving it horizontally with such fury. The world was muted, wrapped in thick layers of white. He moved cautiously along the side of the cabin, the snow crunching loudly under his boots, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the relative quiet. His eyes scanned the swirling gray-white expanse toward the barn, the skeletal cottonwoods, the direction of the frozen creek that marked the eastern boundary of his small holding. Nothing moved but the snow. He reached the slight dip that led down to the creek bank. The water was usually a sluggish ribbon this time of year, but now it lay hidden under a thick, deceptive crust of snow-covered ice. Amos tested the edge cautiously with his boot. It seemed solid, frozen deep. He followed the bank upstream a short distance. The Winchester held ready, his senses straining against the muffling blanket of snow. The silence was oppressive, broken only by his own breathing and the soft sigh of the wind through the bare branches. He was about to turn back, convinced the storm and his own nerves had conjured phantoms, when he saw it, partially buried by fresh powder near the base of a gnarled willow, right where the creek bank steepened. A scrap of darkwood cloth, snagged on a broken branch. It wasn't his. It wasn't Clara's faded homespun. It was finer, darker, like the material of a man's coat, and it was fresh. The snow disturbed around it hadn't yet been completely smoothed over by the wind. Amos knelt, ignoring the cold seeping through his trousers. He carefully dislodged the scrap. It was roughly the size of his palm, torn raggedly. Held close, he could smell the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and cheap tobacco. Ben's scent? He tucked the scrap into his coat pocket, a cold stone of certainty settling in his stomach. Ben wasn't just a phantom. He was close. He'd been here, scouting the land, assessing the cabin, the creek, perhaps looking for a weak point, a way in. Amos scanned the willow, the bank, the open ground beyond. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched, a prickle he'd learned long ago never to ignore, crawled up his spine. He retreated swiftly back to the cabin, pounding on the door. Kane! The bolt scraped, and he stumbled back into the marginally warmer air, slamming and bolting the door behind him. Snow melted from his coat onto the floor. Clara stood near the fire, Ellie now awake in her lap, blinking drowsily. The child looked better, color finally returning to her cheeks, though her eyes were still too large and shadowed in her small face. Claire's expression was pure, unadulterated fear. Find anything? Her voice was tight. Amos pulled a scrap of dark wool from his pocket, holding it out silently. Clara's breath hitched. She reached out a trembling hand, not taking it, just hovering near the fabric. Recognition and a fresh wave of terror washed over her features. His coat, she whispered. That's from Ben's coat. She pulled Ellie closer, burying her face in the child's hair for a moment, seeking strength or comfort. When she looked up, her eyes held a desperate resignation. He's here. He won't leave. Not until... She couldn't finish the sentence. Ellie, disturbed by her mother's tension, whimpered softly. She coughed, a small, dry sound at first, then another, deeper, rattling cough that shook her small frame. Clara's eyes widened in fresh alarm. Ellie? Sweetheart. She pressed a hand to the child's forehead. Oh, no. She's burning up. Panic edged her voice, sharper than any fear Ben. The fragile progress against the cold had been a prelude. The real danger, the one carried in her small, exhausted body, was asserting itself. The relentless exposure had taken its toll. Amos stared at the flushed, coughing child, then at the scrap of dark wool clutched in his hand. Two threats now, closing in, one human and cruel, the other insidious and just as deadly. The storm outside had eased, revealing not freedom, but a more terrible trap. The walls of the cabin, which had felt like protection moments before, now felt like the bars of a cage. He met Clara's terrified gaze, the unspoken question hanging between them. How do you fight an enemy outside when the enemy within might be just as fatal? The silence was broken only by Ellie's worsening cough and a relentless, mocking sigh of the wind finding the chinks in the logs. Ellie's cough tore through the fragile quiet of the cabin, a raw, wrenching sound that seemed to shake her small frame apart. Clara clutched her daughter tighter, rocking back and forth on her knees by the hearth, murmuring desperate pleas lost beneath the rattling breaths. The firelight flickered over Ellie's flushed face, highlighting the unnatural brightness in her eyes, the sheen of sweat on her brow despite the lingering chill in the air. The scrap of Ben's dark wool, still clutched in Amos's hand, felt like a brand against his palm. Two enemies now, one circling like a wolf outside the walls, the other burning within a child who become an unexpected weight in a solitary world. Water, Clara gasped, her voice hoarse with panic. Cold water. Please. Amos moved. Action was the only antidote to the suffocating dread. He grabbed the battered tin bucket, unbolted the door just enough to scoop clean snow from the drift piling against the logs. The wind, though diminished from its earlier fury, still carried a biting edge. He scanned the swirling gray twilight, the skeletal trees, the barn's dark hulk, the endless white expanse toward the creek. Nothing moved but the snow, yet the feeling of being watched, honed in countless night patrols, prickled his skin. He slammed the door, bolted it, and dumped the snow into a smaller pot hanging near the fire. The sizzle as it melted was a small, sharp sound in the tense quiet. Clara was already tearing a strip from the edge of her already frayed underskirt. She soaked it in the rapidly cooling meltwater, wringing out with hands that trembled less from cold now than from sheer terror for her child. She pressed a damp cloth to Ellie's forehead, then her throat, her movements swift, practiced. "Hush now. Sweetheart, hush," she murmured, the words a broken lullaby. "Mama's here. The fever will break." But her eyes, when they flickered up to Amos, held a stark, hopeless plea. She knew the danger. Exposure, exhaustion, the relentless cold. They were thieves stealing a child's strength. Amos watched, the cold stone of dread in his gut growing heavier. He remembered a farmhouse outside Chattanooga, winter '63. A family caught in the crossfire, hiding in a root cellar. A little boy, no older than Ellie, shivering and coughing just like this. They'd found him too late, huddled around a gutter candle. The boy had died in his mother's arms before dawn, the rattle in his chest fading to silence as the first gray light seeped through the cracks. Amos had stood guard outside, useless, listening to the mother's silent grief. He hadn't been able to save them. He'd just borne witness to the aftermath of someone else's cruelty and the indifference of war. The helplessness had carved a scar deeper than any bullet wound. He wouldn't just bear witness this time. He turned from a hearth, the image of that frozen Tennessee dawn fueling a fierce, protective resolve. Sanctuary needed teeth. He dragged a heavy wooden table, scraping harshly on the packed earth floor, barricading it diagonally against the door. Not enough to stop a determined assault, but enough to slow one down, to buy precious seconds. He checked the shutters again, reinforcing the wooden bar with a stout length of firewood wedged beneath it. His Winchester rested against the wall near his cot, loaded, the lever action smooth and ready under his practiced touch. His Colt was a familiar weight at his hip. Every move was deliberate, methodical, the quiet competence of a man fortifying a perimeter he intended to hold. "Yarrow," Clara whispered suddenly, her gaze fixed on Ellie's fever-bright face. "Or willow bark. Do you have any? Anything bitter? For the fever?" Her voice was thin, but held a thread of remembered knowledge. A woman used to tending ills without a doctor's help. Amos paused, scanning his meager stores. He had coffee, salt, flour, jerky. Medicine was a luxury rarely afforded on the high plains. He shook his head, a curt negative. Only whiskey, strong. Clara's face fell, but then a flicker of determination hardened her features. Then whiskey, a little, on the cloth, for her chest. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. A spark of agency flaring in the face of despair. Amos retrieved a small, dark bottle from a high shelf. Cheap, potent stuff, bought for disinfecting wounds more than drinking. He poured a scant amount onto a clean corner of the damp cloth Clara held out. The sharp, acrid smell filled the small space. Clara gently dabbed it on Ellie's chest, the child whimpering at the unfamiliar sting and smell before another coughing fit seized her. Clara held her through it, whispering, her own face etched with shared suffering. As the fit subsided, leaving Ellie limp and gasping, Clara looked up at Amos. The raw fear was still there, but layered over it now was a desperate gratitude, a fragile trust being forged in the crucible of shared crisis. "Ben," she began, her voice barely audible over Ellie's ragged breaths and the wind's low moan. He didn't just want the farm. He wanted obedience. Like I was a horse to be broken. Her fingers brushed the tarnished locket at her throat, a protective gesture. When Ellie came, she was mine. Only mine. He saw her as defiance. Proof I wasn't as alone. She shuddered. A full-body tremor that had nothing to do with cold. He said complications get removed. Her gaze dropped to Ellie, the unspoken horror hanging in the air. That was the memory driving her flight, the terror that had propelled her into the killing blizzard. Amos absorbed her words, the casual cruelty of a man who saw people as property. It stoked the cold fury simmering inside him. He glanced at the high shelf where the small carved blue bird sat, gathering dust. a relic of innocence. He'd carved it for Sarah, his sister, the winter before the fever took her. He'd promised her a whole flock. He'd only finished one. He reached up, his movements unusually deliberate, and took it down. The smooth, fatal felt fragile in his large, callous hand. He didn't offer an explanation, just held it for a moment, tracing the crude wings with his thumb, a silent testament to a loss that still echoed across the years. Then, wordlessly, he placed it gently on the hearthstones near Clara, within Ellie's line of sight as she opened her eyes. A small, silent offering of shared sorrow, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their separate pains. Clara looked at the bird, then at Amos, her eyes glistening in the firelight. She didn't touch it, but her posture softened infinitesimally. A fragile understanding passed between them, unspoken but profound. The whiskey seemed to offer Ellie a brief respite. Her breathing eased slightly, the terrifying rattle softening to a wheeze. She drifted into a fitful sleep, her small hand curled loosely around Clara's finger. The relative quiet felt heavy, charged. Amos knew the lull was deceptive. Ben was still out there. The scrap of wool was proof. He needed to know how close. "Gonna check the perimeter," he stated, pulling his coat back on. Quick look. Need to see. He didn't finish. They both knew what he needed to see. Clara's hand tightened on Ellie's. "Don't." She started, then stopped, swallowing hard. The flicker of concern he'd seen earlier was back, stronger now. "Be quick." It wasn't just a request. It was a shared understanding of the danger. He nodded, hefting the Winchester. Unbolting the door, he slipped out into the deepening dusk. The wind had died to a sigh, the snowfall now a gentle drift. The world was hushed, muffled in white, the silence almost as oppressive as the storm's roar had been. His breath plumed in the frigid air. He moved cautiously along the side of the cabin, scanning the ground, the tree line, the barn. The snow near the creek bank where he'd found the wool scrap was disturbed again, but it could have been the wind or an animal. He circled the cabin, his boots crunching softly. Nothing near the shuttered window, nothing by the woodpile. He approached the barn doors, the latch still secured as he'd left it. He was about to turn back, the cold seeping into his bones, when something caught his eye near the base of the largest cottonwood, 20 paces from the cabin's front door. A deliberate mark, not an animal scratch, not a random break. Someone had taken a knife, a sharp one, and carved a deep, crude X into the frost-rimed bark of the tree trunk. Fresh, the pale wood beneath the bark gleamed wetly in the fading light, sap slowly weeping from a wound. Snow dusted the ground around the tree, but directly beneath the X, the snow was kicked away, as if the carver had stood there deliberately, marking his territory. A warning, a claim. "I'm here. I'm watching. This is mine." Amos's blood ran cold. This wasn't a lurking shadow anymore. This was a declaration. Ben wasn't lost. He wasn't just passing through. He was staking his claim on Clara, on Ellie, and now, by extension, on Amos's land, his solitude, his fragile refuge. The X was a challenge carved in wood, as stark and menacing as a skull nailed to a post. He backed away slowly, rifle held ready, scanning the gathering darkness beneath the trees, the drifts that could hide a man. Nothing moved. The silence pressed in, thick and watchful. He retreated to the cabin door, pounding softly. "Kane!" The bolt scraped open instantly. He stumbled back inside, slamming and bolting the door, leaning against it, breathing hard. The warmth of the cabin felt cloying after the biting cold outside. Clara looked up from Ellie, her eyes wide with silent question. "Tree," Amos managed, his voice rough. "Marked. An X. Fresh." Clara's face went ashen. She understood instantly. The resignation he'd seen earlier hardened into something colder, fiercer. "He's calling me out," she whispered, marking his prey. She looked down at Ellie, her jaw tightening. He won't wait much longer. As if summoned by her words, Ellie stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. She tried to draw a breath, but instead a horrible, wet gurgle came from her chest. Her small body arched, straining. Her lips, already too pale, began to take on a faint, terrifying blue tinge. She was drowning from the inside. "Ellie, no!" Clara's cry was pure, unadulterated terror. She frantically pulled the child upright, patting her back, but the awful, suffocating gurgle only worsened. Ellie's eyes rolled back, her tiny hands clawing weakly at the air. The fragile peace, the tentative connection, shattered. The enemy within had launched its fiercest assault, and the enemy outside was at the gate. Amos stared, frozen for a heartbeat by the sheer, overwhelming horror of it. The carved X outside forgotten in the face of the child's silent, desperate fight for air. The gurgling rattle tearing from Ellie's throat wasn't a sound. It was the scrape of death's fingernails on the door. Clara's cry hung frozen in the cabin's thick air, a raw counterpoint to the wind's dying moan outside. Amos stood paralyzed for a heartbeat. The carved X on the cottonwood forgotten. The lurking threat had been eclipsed by the immediate horror unfolding before the fire. Ellie arched, a tiny bowstring pulled taut by unseen hands, her lips deepening to a terrifying violet. Her eyes, wide and glassy, fixed on nothing. "Turn her." The command ripped from Amos, harsh with remembered helplessness. The image slammed into him. Tennessee, 1864, a smoke-choked cellar. Another child gasping like this while he stood uselessly by, rifle in hand but powerless against the enemy within. Too late then. Not now. On her side. Now. Clara reacted, instinct overriding panic. She rolled Ellie onto her side, thumping her back with desperate force. The awful gurgle choked, sputtered. A thick glob of phlegm, tinged yellow, spattered onto the hearthstone. Ellie gasped a ragged, beautiful intake of air, then collapsed into weak, shuddering sobs. Color, faint but undeniable, crept back into her lips. The immediate drowning ceased, but the fever still raged, a fire consuming her from within. Amos snatched the damp cloth, soaked it anew in the cold meltwater, and pressed it to Ellie's forehead. "Keep her upright," he ordered, his voice rough but steady now, anchored in action. He remembered his mother battling Sarah's fever. Cool cloths, steam, relentless vigilance. Need steam, boiling water. Clara nodded, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. She cradled Ellie upright against her shoulder, the child's head lolling weakly. The kettle, the small one over the fire, tilted just so. Her voice was a thread, but her hands moved with sudden, focused purpose. She positioned the small tin kettle near the flames, not directly on the coals, so that steam began to curl steadily from its spout. Then, shifting Ellie carefully, she leaned the child's face toward the rising vapor, murmuring, "Breathe, sweetheart. Slow breaths. Like Mama." Amos watched, adding another precious split of pine to the flames. The resin sparked, the firelight catching the tear on Clara's cheek and the fierce determination in her eyes. This was her battlefield now, fought with steam and whispered comfort. He saw the tarnished locket bouncing slightly against her collarbone as she moved. "He burned it," she whispered, not looking up, her words meant for Ellie but reaching Amos. "The farm, my pa's place, said it was mine no more, only his. When I hit Ellie, he lit the barn first. Said he'd cleanse the complication." A single, bitter sob escaped her. We ran with the smoke at our backs. The casual, annihilating cruelty of it settled like lead in Amos's gut. He saw it clearly now. Not just a possessive man, but one who erased what he couldn't control. The memory of the Tennessee cellar, the family loss of marauders he'd failed to stop in time, surged back. He'd vowed then, kneeling in the ashes, never again stand idle while innocents burn. That vow, buried deep beneath years of solitude, flared white-hot. His gaze went to the Winchester leaning against the wall, then to the bolted door, and finally to the small, car-blue bird resting on the hearth beside Clara's knee. A promise carved for one lost child, now a silent plea for another. The steam seemed to work. Ellie's breathing, though still labored, lost its desperate, drowning edge. Her whimper subsided into exhausted shivers. Clara kept her position, her own face sheen with sweat and tears, murmuring a lullaby Amos didn't know. Her voice a fragile lifeline cast over the fever's chasm. He kept the fire high, the kettle steaming, the cool cloths coming. Time stretched thin and taut, measured by Ellie's shallow breaths and the slow dance of flames. Then silence, not the suffocating silence of Ellie's struggle, but sudden, unnatural cessation of the wind sigh outside. The quiet pressed against the cabin walls like a physical force. Amos froze, a piece of wood halfway to the fire. Clara's lullaby died on her lips. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto the door. A heavy thud landed against the thick timber. Once, then again, not a knock, a testing blow. Clara! The voice that bellowed to the wood was deep, rough, and thick with possessiveness that made Amos's skin crawl. Open this damn door. Playtime's over. Ellie whimpered, burrowing into Clara's neck. Clara clutched her tighter, her face bloodless. Ben! She breathed, the name a curse. Bring the brat. Ben roared. Come peaceful, and maybe I let the old hermit live, skulking in his hole like a badger. Another heavy thud shook the door. The barricaded table creaked. Amos moved, not with panic, but with the cold, lethal precision of a soldier advancing on an entrenched position. He picked up the Winchester, levering around into the chamber with a smooth, metallic clack-click that echoed in the sudden silence. He met Clara's terrified gaze. Stay with her, he ordered, his voice low and iron-hard. Barred after me, no matter what. Amos, don't. She started, fear from warring with her terror Ben. He burns what he can't break. Amos stated, the image of Clara's farm ablaze fueling his resolve. Won't burn this. He jerked his head towards Ellie. Keep her breathing. He unbolted the top bolt slowly, silently. The lower bolt he left engaged. Taking a deep breath, he yanked the door open just wide enough to slip out, slamming it shut behind him. He heard the heavy iron bar scrape home instantly. The cold hit him, sharp and clean after the cabin's smoky heat. The world was pre-dawn gray, the snow still deep, but the storm had passed, leaving an eerie stillness. 20 paces away, framed by the stark cottonwood with its fresh, brutal X, stood Ben. He matched the voice, tall, broad-shouldered, thick through the chest like a bull. He wore a heavy, dark wool coat, a jagged tear near the hem matching the scrap in Amos's pocket. A battered hat shadowed a face that was all hard plains and stubble, dominated by a thick, broken nose and eyes like chips of flint. A long hunting knife hung at his belt, and a Colt revolver was holstered prominently on his hip. He radiated brute force and a cruel, impatient arrogance. Well, Ben drawled, a humorless grin splitting his face. He took a step forward, his boots crunching loudly in the pristine snow. The badger poked his nose out. Where's my woman? And my problem? She ain't yours, Amos said, his voice flat, carrying easily in the stillness. He held the Winchester casually, barrel pointed down, but his finger rested near the trigger. The child neither. You're trespassing. Ben laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Trespassing? Everything she is belongs to me. Ran off like a spooked mare, dragging my inconvenience. He spat into the snow. Cost me time and trouble tracking her through that damnable snow. Hand her over, old man, and I might ride out. Keep meddling, and I'll burn this rat's nest down around your ears. His hand drifted towards the Colt. Amos didn't flinch. You burned her home once. Not this one. Turn around. Ride out. Now. He shifted his weight slightly, ready. Ben's grin vanished, replaced by a snarl. You think that pop gun scares me? He moved with surprising speed, lunging forward, not for his gun, but close in the distance, his hand going to the knife at his belt. He meant to get Amos up close. Quickly, Amos brought the Winchester up in a blur. Not to shoot. He swung the heavy stock like a club. It connected with Ben's descending forearm just as the knife cleared its sheath. Bone cracked. Ben roared in pain and surprise, the knife flying from his numbed fingers to vanish into the snow. Amos didn't hesitate. He drove forward, using a rifle like a battering ram, the metal but plate slamming into Ben's ribs. Ben staggered back, gasping, his face contorted with rage and pain. "Clara!" Ben bellowed, clutching his ribs, his eyes wild. "You see this? You let this broken-down soldier die for you." He fumbled for his Colt with his uninjured hand. The cabin door flew open. Clara stood silhouetted in the firelight, not cowering, but holding a cast-iron skillet still smoldering from a hearth. Her eyes blazed with fury Amos hadn't seen before. "Leave us alone, Ben," she screamed, her voice raw and powerful. She hurled the heavy skillet with all her strength. It wasn't aimed to hit him, but it landed with a heavy thump and a spray of snow at his feet, startling him, breaking his focus. In that split second of distraction, Amos stepped in. He brought the rifle barrel down hard across Ben's gun hand. The Colt discharged harmlessly into the snow. Amos followed through, driving his shoulder into Ben's chest, sending the bigger man sprawling backwards into a deep drift. Ben floundered, swearing viciously, his injured arm useless, his gun hand numb, snow filling his mouth and eyes. Amos stood over him, the Winchester now leveled squarely at Ben's chest. His breath plumed in the cold air, his gaze steady and cold as the Wyoming dawn breaking on the horizon. "Next time," Amos said, his voice low and deadly calm, "I won't club. I'll shoot. Crawl out of that drift. Find your horse. Ride. If I see you on this land again, I'll put you down like the rabid dog you are." Ben glared up, hatred burning in his eyes, mixed with pain and a dawning realization of defeat. He was wounded, disarmed, humiliated. The icy water soaking through his clothes was sapping his strength. He spat blood and snow. "This ain't over, Kane," he rasped. "It is for you," Amos stated. "Today. Now. Go." With a final, venomous look towards Clara, who stood tall and defiant in the doorway, Ben struggled to his feet, cradling his broken arm, dripping snow. He stumbled away toward the tree line where he'd likely left his horse, disappearing into gray shadows without a backward glance. Amos lowered the rifle, his shoulders slumping slightly as the adrenaline ebbed. He turned back to the cabin. Clara was already moving towards him, her eyes searching his face, then darting towards the trees where Ben had vanished. "Is he?" "Gone," Amos confirmed. "For now." He stepped back inside, bolting the door. The warmth enveloped him, carrying the scent of wood smoke, damp wool, and something else, something quieter. Ellie lay on the wolf pelt near the fire. Her breathing, while still shallow, was even. The terrifying rattle was gone. Her eyes were closed, but her cheeks, though flushed, no longer held the waxy pallor of imminent death. Sweat beaded her forehead, the fever breaking. The carved blue bird rested near her small hand. Clara sank to her knees beside her daughter, pressing a trembling hand to Ellie's forehead, then her chest, feeling the steady rise and fall. A sob escaped her, this time pure relief. She looked up at Amos, tears welling again, but now they were tears of exhaustion and a dawning, incredulous hope. She's cooling. The fever, it's breaking." Her voice trembled. You face him. For us." Amos leaned the Winchester against the wall. The fight was done, the immediate threats vanquished. The silence within the cabin was different now, not charged with dread, but filled with profound quiet of survival. He looked at Clara, kneeling beside her child, at Ellie sleeping peacefully, at the blue bird, a fragile symbol that had weathered the storm. He thought of his empty years, the ghosts he'd carried, the walls he'd built. They felt like ruins now. "The blizzard's past," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "Land still hard. Winter's long." He paused, the words feeling unfamiliar, momentous. This place has got room. If you've a mind to stay, both of you. He didn't say forever, but the offer hung in the warm air, as solid as the logs around them. Clara stared at him, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with a slow, dawning understanding that mirrored the pale light strengthening outside the window. She looked down at Ellie, then back at Amos. Her hand, streaked with soot and tears, reached out and gently touched the smooth of the blue bird. A silent acceptance. A fragile bridge crossed. "We have nowhere else to go," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. Then, a ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first Amos had ever seen. "And we'd be beholden to stay, at least until spring." Her gaze held his, acknowledging the unspoken promise beneath the practical words. The one night had ended. What stretched before them, like the vast, thawing plains under the rising sun, was something entirely new. Amos nodded, a single, slow dip of his chin. He moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. The flames leapt, casting warm, dancing light over the woman, the sleeping child, and the carved bird resting beside them. Outside, the first true rays of dawn painted the snow in shades of rose and gold, glinting on the undisturbed expanse where Ben had fled. Inside, the silence was no longer the silence of solitude, but the quiet, profound sound of a world remade. He settled into the chair beside the hearth, not watching the door now, but watching over them. The vigil had changed. It had just begun.